Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us from different time zones. I'm Lian Liu, a faculty member of Georgia State University's Center for International Business Education and Research, CIBER, in Atlanta, Georgia. We come to you on behalf of the MSI CIBER Consortium that are sponsoring, organizing, and running this webinar series. Since 2020 in April, we have had over 50 webinars with more than 10,000 participants and lots of views of the videos covering topics on research and teaching, featuring talented scholars and business executives. If this is your first time, welcome. These webinars are being recorded. You can find previous sessions on our site, GSU-CIBER website or our YouTube channel. When you exit this session, you will be directed to a brief survey of 5 questions. Please respond and give us feedback and ideas for future topics. Handouts and materials from the speaker, if they are available, will be emailed to you. Everyone except the panelists is muted. Please use the Q&A button for questions to the panelists and use the chat function for questions to our team, and we'll respond. Today's webinar is a collaboration with Emerald Publishing. It's part 2 of a 3-part series on developing global case teaching materials. As in part 1, the moderator is Professor Murad Dakhli, who himself is a master teacher, case writer, and recently won a university-wide Instructional Innovation Award at Georgia State University. Murad will converse with our featured speaker of the series, Professor Rebecca Morris, who is the editor-in-chief of the Case Journal. With that, I now pass the mic to Murad.
Thank you, Leanne. Thank you for that introduction and welcome everybody. So glad to see Rebecca back with us one more time. So this is, as Leanne mentioned, the second session of our 3-part series on global case teaching, how to develop, write, and publish cases. We are glad you can join us. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. If you could please go ahead and start by writing your name and adding it in the chat and tell us who you are and where you are joining us from. So on September 16th, the first offering of this 3-part series focused on generating ideas for the case, developing learning objectives for the case, and the components for a compelling compact case. Today, the second session will focus on drafting compact cases. A few of you submitted actually your draft for consideration, and Professor Rebecca Morris will actually use those as a context to give feedback and guide us through the process of putting the case together, the story together. The third and final workshop now is scheduled for October 28th. Now we will shift attention then to writing the instructor manual and navigating the publication process. So questions about instructor manual and the publication process should be addressed then on October 28th. So a bit about our speaker. Dr. Rebecca Morris is editor-in-chief of the Case Journal. Rebecca is past president and fellow of the Case Association and past president and fellow of the North American Case Research Association, NACRA. Her cases have been published in the top 3 case journals, the Case Research Journal, the Case Journal, and the Business Case Journal. 2 of these cases she mentored as a faculty supervisor have won NACRA's Best Student Authored Case Awards. Rebecca's cases on Nike, GlaxoSmithKline, Abbott Labs, and Kodak have appeared in more than 20 textbooks, including all of the major textbooks in strategic management. She is a frequent presenter at the Case Association of NACRA and various other annual meetings and conferences around the globe. Rebecca has served as the editor-in-chief of the Case Journal since 2016. During this time, the journal moved from 3 issues per year to 6 issues per year. Dr. Morris writes editorial letters on case writing, case research, case teaching. The focus of these letters is to shape and advance the field of case research, writing, and pedagogy. The Case Journal has published 24 editorial essays authored by Dr. Morris. Many of her editorial letters have been listed in the most frequently downloaded articles of the year. Currently, Dr. Morris serves as chair of the Economics and Management Department at Westfield State University in Westfield, Massachusetts. And previously, she taught strategic management and international business courses for 32 years at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. So needless to say, we are delighted to have you with us one more time, and we look forward to your talk. So without further ado, it's all yours, Rebecca.
Well, thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. I had such a good time in the first session that I was really pleased to be able to come back and talk again. And I thought one of the things that I wanted to start with is why I write cases and why I became a case writer. And I think that most of us want to have our scholarly work mean something. We want it to have some sort of impact. And I had gone through the traditional pathway doing empirical research and struggling to get it published, and the sometimes adversarial type of review process that scholarly journals sometimes do, and was a little bit disillusioned because I felt like I was broadcasting words out, but nobody was really paying any attention. They were, I was publishing, yes, but they were, I didn't have the sense that they made a big difference. So I decided to write my first case because I wanted to have an impact. I wanted to make a difference. And I thought, maybe I'm off on this. Maybe I'm triggering something that maybe will cause you to think about case writing. I thought that if I could write a case that could be published in a textbook, at least students would read it. And the students in the classroom would go out and do great things. And so therefore I would have impact. And so I wrote my first case for that reason and haven't looked back. I mean, basically after writing my first case said, I'm a case writer, that's all I'm gonna do. And I want to be the best at that particular area. So hopefully you'll wanna make an impact too, because I think case writing is one of the ways that we can do this in our work. So let's get started with, and I'm going to share my screen here. Okay. And start the slideshow. There we go. All right, so today, and I noticed I have the wrong date on it, my apologies. But first, the first thing that I want to do now that we're in the slides is I want to thank the people that submitted their cases for this session. I got 5 cases. And each one of those authors will receive written feedback from me after this conference by email. And I'm not going to be picking on any particular one of the cases, but what I tried to do is to look at all of them and what were some of the common areas that we could discuss. And so I think that we're going to be doing this sort of in the framework of a case writing workshop. This is typically what would happen. We talked about the adversarial empirical journal reviewers. What you'll find, the case writing community prides itself on constructive feedback. And so in the spirit of constructive feedback, I'm going to talk about some of the common issues that the 5 cases had and how we might correct them or improve upon them so that they could get ready to be considered for publication. So let's get going. One of the things, and you've seen this slide if you were with us last time, is that there are certain conventions that we have to use in case writing, generally accepted conventions. And this is one that's really hard. And that is that you have to write the verbs in your case all in the past tense, except for direct quotes. And the reason for this is that verb tenses and cases and dates get kind of flip-flopping around and going back and forth, and it gets really confusing for the reader. And if you think about it, you're already writing about something that's already happened, even if it happened just yesterday. I mean, so past tense would be appropriate, but it gets kind of awkward when you're writing about like where the headquarters for the company is located, because you want to write, Nike is located in Beaverton, Oregon, which is true. But you have to write it in the past tense. And so a lot of times I get around that kind of thing by saying, well, in 2021, Nike was located in Beaverton, Oregon. because we don't know if your case is a classic and is going to be adopted and used for a long time, if Nike's still going to be in Beaverton, Oregon, the next time somebody reads the case. So you do need to write everything in past tense. This one didn't seem to be as much of a problem for the 5 cases that I read in terms of firms are not people. And so we shouldn't use personal pronouns when we reference them. So if you're talking about Nike, you would say the company name, the ticker symbol, it, but you would not say they, them, or their. Now, if you're talking about the managers of Nike, then you could use personal pronouns. Also, this did show up in some of the examples that I read for this particular session. There shouldn't be any analysis in the case. So this typically shows up as somebody inserting their own opinion. This is what the company should do. These are the recommendations. And my comment on that is that if you put it in the case, then what are the students supposed to do? If you as the author are saying, this is what this company should do to respond to the issues that I've raised, then there really isn't any room for the students to do much of anything. And if students find that there's not much room to do anything, they basically don't do anything. So we want to hold up a little bit and not put the recommendations or any kind of analysis in the case, because we really expect as a teaching case that the students will do that work. Using headings to help readers, I thought the group of cases I had done a good job of this. One of the things you'll find, especially when you start teaching your own cases, is that students will start flipping through pages because they want to reference a key point. And if you use headings, it makes it a whole lot easier for them to find the specific data that they want to talk about in their case discussions. It's just kind of kind to the reader that there is at least a heading to help them identify, okay, we're switching topics, we're going to a new topic here, and I can find it very easily when I want it for discussion. And then this one is an issue in some of the examples that I use. You have to cite specific information, specific data and quotes. So most of the cases, I think there was only one out of the group of 5 that used primary data, where they'd actually interviewed and toured a company and used that information in their case. The rest are based on secondary or external sources, things like annual reports, news media reports, journalistic reports, and so forth. And what you'll find is a case that's primarily, well, that's based on secondary data needs to have lots of footnotes. It needs to have citations to credit the sources that were used in the case for especially specific information. So if you're saying that there were 88 million workers in Colorado that needed help, that number 88 needs a source. And fortunately, the case I'm referencing that used that did actually credit the source. But in other cases, you'll find when I give you the feedback that I will have written source and written a question mark because the source wasn't cited. So secondary cases do expect that you're going to have lots of footnotes to cite sources. So one of the issues that several of the cases that I reviewed had is a lack of focus. The case seemed to kind of meander in lots of different directions. And so we talked about this last time in terms of, asking ourselves the question, what is this case really about? And my sense, as I read some of the cases today, were that some of them would have probably benefited from having a clearer sense of what this case is about. And so I usually suggest that people try to identify a case focus that they can describe in 1 or 2 sentences so that it's clear what this case is about. One of the cases I read, I'm reading the case, I think, okay, the first page, it's marketing. The second page, it's a marketing case. The third page, it's a marketing case. The fourth page, all of a sudden it became something else. And it was like, wait a minute, I thought this was a marketing case. And so, it seemed that if the author had a stronger sense of what the case was really about, we wouldn't have this confusion that all of a sudden at the end of the case, there's a new issue that's been introduced and there really isn't enough information about that issue to address, but it adds confusion. Think about the student that has read the case and is thinking one thing, and then at the end, there's all of a sudden a surprise issue that comes up that's completely different. That student's going to be just as confused as I was. And confused students, we know, don't do the best analysis. So it helps us to clarify the focus so that that doesn't happen. It also improves the efficiency of the case writing because you know what needs to be in there and what doesn't. So if the case is about this other issue you introduced on the last page, then you can cut the first 4 pages because it's not about that. And then add the correct information in. Or you can say, okay, it really was a marketing case that I wanted to write. And so now I don't need this last piece because it distracted the student from what was really the focus. It also helps you decide how to frame the case. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But one of the things that I kind of keep in mind as I'm writing a case is thinking about what I'd like the students to do. If you think about what should their analysis look like, what models might they have applied, what kind of decision-making do you want them to do? If you think about what you want as an outcome, then you can go backwards to the case and say, okay, what do I need to provide in the case so that students can reach the outcome that I want? And so that generally helps also streamline and focus the case a little bit better. So when we talk about framing the case, one of the ways we frame cases is by choosing a timeline. And if you, I've got a slide here, timeline of an old company. I just made it very generic. If you think about a case, companies, this particular company we're going to assume has existed since 1871, and it's still in existence in 2021. So there are all sorts of stories, issues, problems throughout this company's history, and we have to decide what snapshot we want to take of that company. So let's look at a couple of examples. We could focus on the deep history, 1871 to 2000, the founding of the company, there's a change in customer demographics, and bad news, there's a sales decline. Okay, if we focus in this way, then it's fairly clear what students should do. We got bad news in 2000, sales decline. And so the students would then be developing recommendations for how do they fix this, right? And so that makes that framework work fairly well. But I will tell you, if a student reads 1871, they usually cross their eyes and aren't very interested in that kind of deep history. And they wonder about the relevance of the case in today's world. And they might have a point there. So sometimes we have to be careful that we don't go too deep in our history. Another thing that we could look at is the modern framework. So in 2000, we had this bad sales decline. The company's having all sorts of trouble. And in 2014, they make a change in leadership. Well, we all know that a change in leadership usually means that there's going to be a change in strategies and what the company's doing and so forth. And it looks like in 2021, this company's successful. There's a turnaround and the strategies produce the correct results. Now consider this case framework. If we use 2000 to 2021, what do we want the students to do? The company's successful. If I was a student, I'd say, hey, they should just keep doing what they've been doing, right? 2021 looks like it turned it around. Let's just keep doing that. And that really isn't, I don't think, the kind of thinking we want to have our students address. It's really hard for them to work with a best company case where everything is great in the company and they run out of recommendations. What should the company do next? Well, it looks like they're doing the right thing. So just keep them doing that. I would suggest that a better framework might be this one. And that is to just focus on bad news. Things are really going badly. And we have a change in leadership. Now it seems fairly obvious what students should do, right? Because in this framework, they have the opportunity to make recommendations for the new leader. How does the new leader fix the problem? And so if you think about it, we have to decide how we're going to take that snapshot of the company and be able to include it in the case. And so kind of keep in mind that we don't want to back the students into a corner where there's really nothing for them to do, because as you probably have recognized in teaching, if students feel that there's nothing to do, they basically do nothing. So we want to give them room and give them some sense of what they need to work on by the date lines and the focus that we choose, the framework for the case itself. Another issue that I noticed in the 5 cases is the opening hooks were a bit confusing. If you remember when we talked last time, the opening hook is supposed to be the initial paragraph or 2 of the case, and it's supposed to grab that reader and get them to read further. And so it needs to be fairly clear what the case is about. And one of the frameworks that we oftentimes use when we're writing opening hooks is one that's very common in journalism. If you think about the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, or any other newspaper, most journalists will use this framework to write the first paragraph of the article, because they know if they don't grab that reader right off the bat, they're not going to read to the bottom of the page. So the same is true for cases. So we identify who was involved, what happened, when did it happen, where did it happen, why did it happen, and how did it happen. And I have an example from one of my cases to illustrate that. So this was the case I wrote on Chipotle. It's a compact case, so not a lot of room to write an opening hook. And so I color coded this one so you could see the W's there. So I focused on who, when, what, where. So in January 2015, executives at Chipotle, that's the who, decided to stop serving pork at 600 of its restaurants. That's the what, nationwide. Maybe I could have been better and said, in the United States, due to animal welfare violations by one of the burrito chain's key suppliers. So we have this sense that this is what the case is about. And the idea is that then the student reader will have an understanding, okay, we're in 2015 at this time in the case, and the issues are about this supply chain problem. And, they'll start making mental notes of the things that reinforce that problem. Some of the cases that I read for today, this isn't as clear. I would read like a whole page and say, what is this case really about? When is it set? What's really happening here? I'm not sure I know what this case is about. Now, I'm a little bit more patient with that than a student might be. So you need to kind of set the stage in the opening hook as to where the case is set, when, what, where, all those W's in the how. And then you need to also make it interesting enough that the reader wants to know, well, how's this going to turn out? They've got a problem, but what's going to happen? What's next? And you want them to be able to read further into the case. So I would recommend that as you write cases, you think about this opening hook and maybe use the framework to ground the case in a particular time, place, and company so that it's clear what the case is about before people read further. Another issue is exhibits. Only a couple of the cases that I read had any exhibits at all. The rest of them were just narrative. And we know that people learn in different ways. And so one of the reasons we use exhibits in cases is to address the visual learning style. People that learn better by seeing things rather than reading about them. The title of this slide says, a picture is worth 1,000 words except when writing a compact case. And that's one of the things I wanted to remind you about. It's a joke, really, because exhibits are not counted against the 1,000 word limit for compact cases. So sometimes you can conserve narrative. You take something that would require you to use 2 or 3 paragraphs and convert it to an exhibit instead. And that can be beneficial to both keeping the case within the word limit, but also addressing people that learn differently than those that learn through text material. But one of the things that we have to watch is that sometimes exhibits cause issues with the publishers in terms of permission and rights. So I've got 2 examples of exhibits that were in cases that we published in the case journal. The pie chart is for a case that was about a soda tax that was passed in Philadelphia and was, I think, a really good example of a very clear chart, that has everything labeled really well. It communicates a lot. You'll notice that one of the expenditures is really, really tiny. And if you didn't explode this particular pie chart, you'd lose that one. And, so this author has done a really good job of communicating information in a graphic way. The other one's a photo. Photos are really a bit of a challenge in cases because sometimes they're just not all that relevant. So this particular case was about a doll that is realistically proportioned. So she's not Barbie. It's called Lamely is the name of the company. And she's a realistic doll. Now, how would you describe, think about how much narrative it would take to tell how this doll differs from Barbie. But photos do a little bit better job of that. And so these photos actually add to the case. So that it's showing the doll, it's showing some of the accessories, and it's trying to distinguish or differentiate this particular doll from all other dolls. Pictures of people like the CEO or the board of directors oftentimes don't really add a lot to the case itself. I mean, it's usually a bunch of old white guys. And if that's, a key issue in the case, then yes, include the picture. But if, just to have a picture of the CEO, if it doesn't really show us anything or, give us any indication of who that person is or his personality or her personality, then, it's better not to have the photo. So be judicious about your photos and do recognize that if you just cut and paste the income statement and balance sheet from their annual report, you're probably going to have a permission issue because even though you cite the source, you're copying something literally. I usually recommend to people that they use the data from the annual report and throw it into a spreadsheet to create their own chart. And then that they reference it by saying adapted from, and then put the annual report citation. And that generally is okay. For photos, I have a colleague that wrote a case about Starbucks, and she was talking about their dress code. She put a photo from the Starbucks website of their employees and what was acceptable dress and what was not. And we had permissions issues with it. Their Starbucks doesn't allow people to publish things from their website. And so I said to the authors, just describe the people and what they're wearing, and then use that. Don't use the photo itself, because really it's a photo of a bunch of people standing around in green aprons. It really didn't communicate all that much. And we could get around the rights issue by describing the photo rather than including the photo. In the body of the case, there are lots of things that can go wrong, and they often do. I do these myself, so I'm not immune to these mistakes or these issues. And so what I've tried to do is I put a bunch of them on the slide so we could kind of briefly talk through them. One thing is, cases get really confusing because they have lots of different references to specific times. And if you think about it, you're writing the case in 2021. You may submit it to a journal at the end of the semester, and that'll mean that it won't get published at the earliest till 2022, maybe not till 2023, because you might have to do a revision. And so when you use vague time references, the reader becomes confused. You're writing it today and you're saying this decade, but if it doesn't get published till later, then what decade are you really talking about? Or if you're saying 2 years ago, is that 2020 and 2019, or is it, it gets very, very confusing. So it's just better if you use a specific year, month, or day to identify the time reference rather than using vague references like currently, recently, and things like that. Is currently today, or is it the day I read the case? When's currently? So try to be more specific about your time references to help people be less confused as they read your case. Undefined trends. So this is an example from one of the cases I read, high frequency of transactions. Okay, I'm not familiar with the case, the industry, or what a high frequency might mean. Does that mean 5 a day? Does it mean thousands a day? Does it mean millions a day? What does it really mean? And so we can do that by providing a specific number per day, or we can provide comparative data, that they had 20% more transactions than their closest competitor or something like that, that would give us a sense of that they were really experiencing a high frequency. A third thing is the lack of supporting data. So sometimes we'll have somebody make a statement the company built a significant customer base. And I'm sitting there saying, okay, what does that mean really? Again, I'm not as familiar with the industry as you are. And I may not know how many customers are significant, so tell us. They saw, their sales growth doubled. Well, that tells me something that it probably is significant, or tripled, or grew rather rapidly. A graph would be good. Sorry, to explain this. And then there's the whole thing with unfamiliar terminology. So one of the cases that I read today was really an interesting case, kept talking about circular economy. And I'm not sure whether that is just my lack of knowledge about it, or whether that terminology is not as well known outside of the particular area where this case was written. If you're going to use a terminology that's perhaps not common in textbooks, or it isn't typically covered in a particular course, you might need to define it. And in this particular case, you could use a diagram to show what you mean by this. And it would really add to the case itself. So watch jargon, things that people might not be familiar with. Remember that we're often writing for a global audience. And so what's familiar for us may not be familiar for somebody else. And so sometimes, put a footnote in and just define what you mean by this at once, and then you can use the terminology throughout the case and we'll have a better understanding. The last one on this list is the lack of citations for data, which we've talked about a little bit. And there's that $88 million working adults that I was referencing. And just again, a reminder that secondary cases are expected to have lots of citations, because we're going to be drawing our information that we're using in the case, the data itself, from a lot of different sources. And we want to make sure that we credit the sources that we've used. So another thing that we need to do as we write cases to make them more compelling and engaging for our students is we need to add a human element. And we do that typically by identifying someone. It might be the CEO, it might be a key manager, depending upon the focus of the case, that we can quote. And what we hope, if we're using secondary sources, is that the person we've chosen, the protagonist, is quoted a lot in news sources, or that there is YouTube videos out there that we can pick quotes off of. But we hope that we can find the person's voice, so that what we're trying to do by having the person quoted instead of writing it narrative, we could talk about the enthusiasm of the CEO, but it would be far better if he described something himself that revealed that piece of his or her personality. So we want quotes so that students have someone to relate to in the case. If they can identify with a person, they tend to get more drawn into the case. They then want to actually do work because they feel like, well, I could help this person. And it tends to keep them more involved in the case itself. So some potential sources, newspaper articles can be a good source. And one of the things that I usually remind people of is that if you are writing about a well-known company, yes, there is national press that you might be able to use, but a lot of times their local paper will cover them in more depth than the national papers. So when I was writing my Nike case, I used the Beaverton, Oregon local paper to find a lot of times they would quote managers at Nike in stories that they were writing. And so it can be a really good thing to do. And you can find those, I use LexisNexis to get those access to those kind of newspaper articles. Today now, as we all turned more to video, video clips are all over. TED Talks might be a good place to look. YouTube is certainly a good source. Even the company's website might have video content of individuals talking that you could cite. We also hope that your CEO gives speeches. Sometimes they'll give a speech at their alma mater, and the university will record their speech, and you can use that to find quotes. Also in the United States, publicly traded companies do earnings calls on a quarterly basis where the executives for the company are doing a presentation for investors. And a lot of those are recorded, that there are oftentimes transcripts. The recordings are better because you can see the people and see what their expression is, and those can be used. We're at the end of the case. So Murad, I see you're on, so I'm hopefully doing okay on time, and we'll finish up just really
You're
quickly.
fine.
So
Great,
the end of
thank
the case is, the purpose of it is to remind students of what the key issues of the case were. I mean, they've read several pages now. You want to, again, refocus them so that they know what they have to do next. And we want to give them a call to action. So we want to signal to them what they should do. And we typically don't put actual discussion questions or assignment questions at the end of a case. And that's because our cases are going to be used in a lot of different kinds of courses worldwide. And we want the instructor that's using the case to decide what the assignment should be. So we sometimes use rhetorical questions. And this is again from the case that I wrote. So Els is the CEO at the time, felt that the food with integrity philosophy was an integral part of Chipotle's brand identity. But were supply chain problems going to force trade-offs? Was it still possible to continue Chipotle's rapid growth while preserving food integrity? So the purple highlight is the reminder, this is what the issue is about. It's about food with integrity. And the last parts are, you know, in a sense, the call to action for the students. This is what the things you should be thinking about, student, as you get ready to do your assignment. You know, what are the supply chain problems, and is it going to cause them to have to address whether they can grow as rapidly as they have been? And that, you know, is kind of the send off for the case. And a lot of times cases don't have very good closing hooks and they kind of trail off. And what tends to happen when I read them is I start turning pages. Am I at the end yet? Is this really the end? Wait a minute. Am I missing a page somewhere? So you really want to make it clear. This is the end. And, you know, this is what you students should be doing. And, you know, if we don't do that, the students oftentimes say, what am I supposed to, you know, how am I supposed to manage this? And, you know, undergraduate students probably need this more than graduate students. But, you know, again, it's a good way to end the case so that people are reminded of the issues. The last thing that I want to talk about at this point is that classroom testing is important. If you've written a case, you really need to test it in your class. Teaching it in a class that's the same as the target audience that you've identified for the case. Sometimes if you're not teaching that class, maybe you can get a colleague to allow the case to be used in their class. And one of the things that I want you to do when you teach the case in your class is to remember that you know more about the case situation than anybody else in the world. And our tendency, because we're generous, kind instructors, is to help students when they get confused. And so a lot of times, if I'm teaching my own case and I notice that students are getting confused, I will jump in to save them. And I will add information. I'll say, oh, you're confused about that? Well, here's what really happened. And then I'll add some more information. Well, the problem with that is that when the case goes out into the world and is published and other people want to use it, you're not there to help them. And so if the students are confused by a particular issue, they're going to stay confused because the person that adopted the case doesn't have the depth of knowledge that you do. So I usually have somebody, one of my colleagues, sit into the case session when I'm teaching it, and I have them make notes of what I say. So what did I add to the discussion that now I need to go back and put in the case? And so you could do it, you could record yourself, although who wants to watch their own recording, which is why I do the notes. But it really helps me identify areas that I need to improve in the case. And so classroom testing, and then I might test it again to see if what I added fixed it, or if they're still confused. You also want to watch the nonverbal cues to gauge student interest. You know, as you're discussing the case, are they engaged? Are they staying focused? Are they asking questions? Are they adding to the discussion? Or are they looking out the window or down at their cool shoes? So you want to make sure that you're aware of you got to read the room. How is the room going with this? Are they addressing things that I want them to address, or are they distracted? All of those kind of things. And, you know, we want to make modifications to the case so that we can get rid of those things. So with that, I think we're at a good point to maybe address some of the questions, because I want to allow enough time for people to ask their questions. So Murad, you're going to help me with that?
Yes, thank you, Rebecca. That was very interesting and practical. And we do have few questions here, and there are actually a couple of questions that from last session that are much more related to the discussion today. So I'll go ahead and bring those up also. But the first question we have here is, you were talking about the past tense, using past tense for cases. Should the title of the case study be in the past tense also?
Well, you're writing about something that's already happened. So yes, it probably should be in the past tense.
The title. Okay, so everything in that case. Very good.
The only thing that you don't put in the past tense is when you're quoting the protagonists or any of the managers in the company.
Okay, and verbatim, of course, taken
Yeah.
back. Okay. Here, James asks, if you work in the company, can you cite yourself as a source of the information?
It's important that you disclose that you're one of the characters in the case. You can change your name so that's called disguise, and you can, you know, give yourself a different name so that it doesn't look like that conflict. But you should disclose it in the teaching note or the instructor's manual, because reviewers are now going to have an issue with credibility. Are you being objective in the data that you're presenting, or are you giving a very slanted view of what's going on at the company? So yes, you can be one of the characters. A lot of times entrepreneurs will work with a case writer, and so they'll be a co-author, but they're also the main person in the case.
This is actually related to this question. Can you write a real life case involving a real organization, but anonymize, disguise, I guess, the names to protect their privacy?
We just do a lot of disguising of names, you know, especially ethics cases or org behavior cases where there might be like some discrimination issues or things like that. We'll disguise the names of the individuals that are involved to protect them from scrutiny. I mean, today a student might email the person and ask them what really happened. And we really want to protect people. But again, you disclose that usually in a footnote at the first page of the case, that some of the names have been disguised. But you still would need a case release from the company in order to publish that, even though you may have even changed the name of the company. The one thing you have to watch when you do disguise is that if you make it super obvious that you've disguised the case, so, you know, Bob Smith is in the case. So you've used like the most common of names to identify your people. Students usually can sense that there's something made up about the case. And when they see it as fiction rather than fact, they often don't do much in terms of analysis. And some of them will refuse to read further. So you want to choose names that aren't the people's names, but could be real names rather than fake names. And then if you're going to disguise the name of the company, you want to make sure, you know, do a Google search to make sure you're not picking a name that is a real company, that's not the one that you wrote about. So you want to make sure that you kind of protected people. I thought it was interesting. One of the cases that I read for today was about banking in India, and the name of the company was Standard Chartered Bank. And I thought, oh, this is fiction. This is fiction for sure. And then I Googled and found out, oh, it's a real bank in India. And so, you know, I mean, that was one of the triggers that as an editor, I would have looked at this and said, is this real or is this made up? And so it's pretty interesting to me that the names, I Googled all of them. And the names in the case are real people and real companies. And so I thought, well, that just shows you culturally how little I know about India and banking.
In fact, the question that was asked earlier is the case, this person is writing is an ethics a fraud case, and that's why anonymity is important. So you address that. Just to clarify, Rebecca, if you are sending a case and you anonymize the key actors in that case, does the editor have the right to say who are these people, or who is this company, to provide that kind of comfort level that it is the real case? Or if is that okay? And then it's anonymous for the reader, other readers, but not for the reviewer or the editor.
I usually, if my little radar goes up and I think it might be fictionalized, I will email the author and say, is this real? Are these real people in a real company? Are they, is the situation real? And in one case, it was a fraud case, and they had cited legal documents that had been submitted in the lawsuit, and had blanked out the names of the people because, again, they're trying to keep them anonymous. And I just said to him, look, I will keep this confidential, but I need to verify that this is real. And so if you can just tell me the names, then I will check, and then we'll just delete it. It never became part of the file. It wasn't disclosed in any way. And I have not told anybody who the real people were. But it was important that we verify, because I was just concerned that the case credibility would be questioned. And so once I was sure that it was real, then we could proceed with it.
Okay. And as one comment here, or actually a question, instead of names, one can just use titles, right, in a case, as opposed to the CEO, the director of HR, and you keep using those throughout. You
can use titles, but you'll find that students will be less engaged with the case because they're not people. And they one of the things that cases a lot of times will illustrate is how people complicate things, that they make the wrong choice, or they do the wrong thing, or they're especially generous and they do the right thing. But if you're using titles, you're going to lose that. And so I would recommend that you consider just changing the names. Okay, if you're writing about Amazon, you're writing about the CEO, we all know it's Jeff Bezos. So, there you really don't have the opportunity to hide that information because it's so well known. But other companies, it may be kind to allow disguise. A lot of case writers want to remain in the real and want to use the right names, but if they're having trouble getting that signed release to publish, will agree then to disguise names in order to protect people. And it's generally kind of considered good form to change the names, especially like in HR discrimination cases and things like that, ethics cases, to change the names of lower level employees, because we don't need them to be embarrassed if this information gets out.
Makes sense. I know just an example, we wrote a case about Tesco in China, Tesco failure in China. I know we had interviews with 2 or 3 experts. And one thing we had to go back and obtain is a permission from them to publish what they had to say. And that's something we had to do ad hoc.
Well, and sometimes the person will look at what you're quoting and they'll say, oh, I don't sound very good there. I sound grumpier than I meant to be, or, and so then, as case writers, we can say to them, okay, we can delete that quote, but what would you say today instead? And so they tend to clean themselves up a little bit. And, and that might be something you have to do in order to get the release. So, sometimes you have to kind of twist their arm, because maybe the quote that they gave you at first was really good and you want to make sure that you have it in the case. But sometimes it's better to lose the quote than it is to not get the case published. So trade-offs.
Yes. We had, in that specific case, there were minor tweaks, so it sounded better, I guess. It's more like almost like correcting the English more than anything else. And that was, I guess.
Well, or sometimes the CEO swears and doesn't want it in the published form. Okay, fine. We can delete those words.
Very good. There's an interesting question here. It was one of actually my own questions, if it were not asked, is about students like to watch short videos when reading long cases, or even with compact cases sometimes. What do you think about using videos in case studies? Is it better to have it in the teaching note to support the main idea of the case, or it can be part of the actual case you submit?
It depends. I mean, there are lots of different ways to do this. So Yale does what they call raw cases. And what they do is they have a website that goes with the case, and you could put the video links there. The challenge with that approach is that we have no control over whether the students actually watch those videos or not. And if you're using those as part of the discussion, that's a little bit challenging. If you put them in the teaching note, then the instructor chooses whether to have the whole group watch the video or post it on their learning management system. And what's useful when you use videos is to provide an indication of what the video is about, so the instructor will know, you know, do I want to use this or do I not? And how long the video lasts, so that they know, you know, should I plan, I'm going to use this 2-minute video to start the case. And then at the end, I'm going to use this 5-minute video to bring the case to a close. So you want to give them some sense of how long it's going to take them in the class and where they should use it in the discussion, and how, you know, what it's going to add to the discussion. And a lot of students love it because they like to see the actual people that they're reading about talk. And so the Kodak case I wrote, there was a Kara Swisher from the New York Times interviewed the CEO, and it was a really good clip of, you know, him talking about their strategies. And the students loved it because the whole case was about the strategic direction of the company. And here you have the CEO, you know, laying it out for questioning journalists. And it was kind of fun because at one point, the journalist looked at the CEO and said, "What happened to Kodak? It used to be great. Now it sucks." You know, and you could just see the CEO tense up, and it really added a lot to the discussion that, you know, of how he was doing and, you know, what was going on with him, you know, that obviously there had been a big change in the company's direction. And, you know, he was there trying to spin it and give kind of the positive, and this journalist was having none of that.
Interesting. I know my students like videos, and they really like, and sometimes we just watch a more recent video about the case once we are completely done with analyzing the case. They actually enjoy it. They feel like they know enough that that video becomes more interesting or more relevant.
Well, one of the things I forgot to mention, and that was important in the cases that I read, if you're writing a marketing case, one would expect that there would be customers in this case, that we would have some idea of what customers were thinking. And video clips would be a good way to do that. We wrote a case on Lululemon and some of their problems, and there were news stories that we could show this short video clip about something, and at that time the CEO was making inappropriate statements in the press, and so you could show it, and you could show consumer reactions. So you know, they interviewed a person on the street walking out of the store. Well, that's good, valuable information in a marketing case. So you can use those videos to illustrate some of the points you want to make. But, you know, one would expect customers in a marketing case.
Yeah, yes. We have a question or two here about photographs. One of the questions from Vishanti is, when using photographs, is it okay to have a photograph of an individual who are in the background? Should their faces be blurred for privacy reason if they happen to be in the picture? And I think
you will get a release issue if they're in the picture.
Yes.
I mean, in the sense that that could be a problem. Photographs are really interesting. It's actually easiest if you take the photograph yourself rather than using somebody else's photograph, because then you don't have to have permission. So you took a photo of a store display for a marketing case. That's perfectly fine. You credit yourself as the photographer and you can use that. But you know, when you start, you know, it's so easy to cut and paste things from the internet, and then we have issues. In that we have to have releases for some of them. Some of them we can still use in terms of educational use, and those are allowed. But one of the challenges that we sometimes have is, I'm in North America and I understand copyright in North America, but the journal is published in the UK and there's differences. And so sometimes we'll do things and say, yeah, this should be fine. This is exactly educational fair use. And the publisher will say, oh no, This is not, and you have to have a release. So you want to be kind of careful about those kind of things. And again, it's easiest if you just take the photo yourself than it is to use other people's photos.
Yeah, I know in this specific case, they are referring to the incident where there's a ship that caught fire off the Sea of Sri Lanka, and then there were some pictures that already been published, and they actually do show people in the background. And the question is, would it be fair to use those that have already been, I'm assuming, published in mainstream newspapers?
Mm-hmm.
And that will save, as far as describing the situations, as some of these pictures can be telling and save a lot of.
And it may also depend upon what the issue is in the photograph. I mean, if it's just a passerby, it may be more harmless than if it's showing somebody doing something really bad, you know, that might cause more concern, that we're outing somebody in a way that perhaps we shouldn't. But you can use social media photos and things that you see in the press if you cite the sources. We may have release issues on some of them, but you know, that's something that can be addressed. But you have to really talk about the relevance of the photography. Is it really important that I have this? Does it add to the story, or is it just one of those things? So when I wrote the Chipotle case, and this is a great example, I put a picture of a burrito in the Chipotle case. It was colored. I thought, oh, this will be so engaging for students because it's a picture. Well, what did it really communicate? Nothing. I mean, it was like, you know, you couldn't even tell it was a Chipotle burrito. And, you know, the fact that it was not, you know, you couldn't look at the photograph and say, well, it's sustainable pork. It really just added nothing. So when I had to delete it, it was like, well, of course I have to delete that. It really didn't do anything.
Yeah. We have a few more questions, but I want to make sure we are also cognizant of the time limit here. One of the questions is on the hook at the end of the case. Can you use the protagonist at the end, considering the questions we want the students to explore? So similar to what you were talking about there at the closing hook.
You can use the protagonist if the protagonist actually did it. You know, sometimes people will make the protagonist be in a setting, you know, they're usually looking out the window and they're rubbing their chin and they're thinking. Well, if the protagonist actually did that, you can say that. But, you know, a lot of times this is where literary license kind of creeps into a case. And so the guy is, or the gal is looking, you know, and rubbing her chin, and she's thinking about the, you know, the issues of the case. And oh, the snow is gently falling, and you know, it's like all sorts of stuff. And it's like, these are kind of, we consider those cliches, and students read those and know it's not real. So you sometimes want to ask the protagonist, if you're doing interviews, what were you really thinking the night before the board meeting when you had to present your solution to this problem? You know, and, you know, did it keep you up all night? You know, if it did, then you can write that in and say, well, the protagonist was, you know, at 3 in the morning having a cup of coffee and working through the papers on his kitchen table. That's real. And students like that. But to make up this cliche kind of scenario, not a good idea.
Okay. Maybe one last question here, an interesting question. Does AACSB accept cases as part of an accreditation process? I mean, I'm not sure what type of accreditation we're talking about in this case, but maybe on the promotion, assessment, review part of in business education.
Well, I will tell you that AACSB a long time ago declared cases as appropriate scholarly contributions. And the reason they did this is because of the instructor's manual or the teaching note, because that's where the case writer does his or her own analysis of the case. And so it's the case is perceived as the data, and then the teaching note or the instructor's manual then is the critical analysis of the case. And you know, there are parts of the teaching note that'll read a little bit like the discussion section in an empirical article, and then there will be some sort of conclusions. And so because we write the instructor's manual, it is considered to be a scholarly contribution, but the value of it depends upon the school that you're in and what their mission is. So cases turn out to be really important in teaching schools. So where teaching is the primary focus, and empirical work and scholarly work is perhaps maybe a little lower on the list of priorities. So a case then actually serves two buckets, because the case itself is considered pedagogy. And there is certainly some pedagogy elements in the teaching elements in the instructor's manual. So, you know, you're demonstrating, okay, if I'm going to teach this case, here's how I do it most effectively. That's a pedagogical contribution, and it helps support the fact that you're a teaching school. And then the instructor's manual, the other parts, the theoretical and the analysis, can be considered. I always thought we should count it twice, but that generally doesn't happen. You usually only get one hit for a case, but it is considered acceptable scholarly contributions. I did a presentation at the AACSB Dean's Conference on that very fact, and we positioned cases there as a way to get people that aren't publishing, or perhaps professors of practice, to do scholarly work that could contribute to our accreditation. Because a lot of people, professors of practice, they have significant business careers, they have contacts, they could probably get case locations to support their work. And they're probably going to be better skilled at writing a case than they would doing empirical work. So it can be a real winner for them. Very
good. Thank you, Rebecca. I know there are a couple of questions about resources. The Kodak case, quite a few people, I think, mentioned that they would love to have a copy of that case. You referenced it a couple of times, and I can follow up on that. There are a lot of food for thought. Thank you so much. This was very helpful. I know for me, as someone who's more and more engaged in writing cases, I'm sure for our listeners. I want to thank you again for joining us for this second part of a three-part series. A reminder to everybody that the next and final session is scheduled the same time on October 28th. And also a reminder that there is a survey at the end of this presentation, and you will receive the link to that survey. So to please go ahead and complete the survey. Until the October 28th, I want to thank you again, Rebecca, and thank our guests for joining us, and see you in a couple of weeks.
Keep writing those cases. Hopefully you want to do the same thing I did and want to have an impact. Write cases.
They are fun to write. They are fun to research, and they are fun to write.
Mm-hmm.